Well, hey everybody, today we're going to do a special 1 week standalone message. And as we begin our time today, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had a song that's been stuck in your head and you just couldn't get it out? It's a song that's literally living rent-free in your head and playing over and over again. Now, there's a scientific term for this. It's called the Dua Lipa Loop. Okay, not really. But I want you to understand that there are those things that it's hard to get out of your head. Like when you hear a song that talks about my sugaboo or I'm levitating, sometimes those things get really stuck in your head. And it's actually called involuntary musical imagery. It's when a chunk of a song gets stuck in your head and it plays on repeat, even when you don't want it to. And it's one thing when you love a song and you can't stop singing it, but there's something incredibly frustrating about a song popping into your head when you don't want it to be, or when you haven't given it the consent to be there. And I think there's a reason that this is so infuriating. It's because we all have a bare minimum of what we want in our heads. We only want to think about the things that we actually want to think about. And anytime that something, kind of hijacks your brain that you wish wasn't there, it's really a bad experience. And while you can't necessarily stop the song or even some of the thoughts that pop in your head, there's probably a voice that comes to it, when we allow it to affect ourselves and affect our relationships. And so the word that we want to use to talk about that particular voice is consent. And because we're going to be using that word a lot throughout this lesson, I want you to understand something. I'm going to define this in a particular way so that we're all on the same page moving forward. So consent simply means agreeing to do something or allowing something to take place. So consent simply means agreeing to do something or allowing something to take place. It means this, that you're actively wanting something to happen and you're giving permission for it. So we give consent and we ask for consent, or sometimes we ignore consent. And sometimes those are done in really small ways, and sometimes it's done in pretty significant ways. But consent is one tool we can all use to help our relationships stay in a good place. Consent is a tool that we can all use to help our relationships stay in a good place. And when we typically hear the word consent, it's typically used in topics like when we're talking about dating or sex, and both of those are really important topics, but it applies to more than just that. So yes, there is consent needed to go on a date, or to do something sexually, to give a hug, or to joke about something that matters to the other person, to borrow the other person's clothes, or consent to share your data when you check that little box that says terms and conditions. You see, in other words, consent is a really important thing for you and I to be talking about. But if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking to yourself, why are we talking about this at a church? And in some ways, it does feel like a strange topic. But the truth is that consent shows up all over our culture. Now, we typically see it in stories or in news reports where consent wasn't really a part of decisions, or where bad things happened as a result of not giving their consent. And the message that our culture gives us is this kind of idea that, well, as long as two people consent, no matter what the issue is, you're good. In other words, consent often answers the question that most of us are really asking when we're trying to decide what to do. And that question is this: will I get in trouble? That's the real question that a lot of us ask in situations, is will I get in trouble? And when everyone consents, we say, well, the answer is no. And not only that, but we like to get as close to the line as we possibly can without actually going over it. So on a basic level, it comes down to this: how we treat other people. And when it comes to that idea of how we treat other people, most of us tend to behave with a minimum requirement mindset. Here's what I mean by that, is instead of asking ourselves what we should do to treat others well or to build them up, we tend to look for the least we can do while not getting in trouble and still getting what we want. So instead of asking ourselves how we should treat other people or how we should build them up, we tend to look really for the least, or what can we do while not getting in trouble, but yet still getting what we really want. And what's really on the other side of that line? Well, we usually try to push it. Let me give you a few examples here. When it comes to how you talk to your parent or your caregiver, you use just enough sarcasm or just enough attitude to make a point, but not so much that you sound like a total jerk. Or when you're at school saying something about a person that you don't really like, you tend to think about what you can actually say and what you can get away with without getting yourself into trouble. Or when it comes to romantic relationships, you focus on things that, they didn't tell you not to do. So if they didn't say no, then it's surely okay to try, right? In other words, we look for the minimum requirements. As humans, our temptation is always to do the least amount of good behavior that we should and the maximum amount of bad behavior that we can actually get away with. And if you've been on the receiving end of this type of behavior or pressure, or what you wanted wasn't really considered, then you don't need me to tell you how bad or confusing this actually feels. And whether you consented or you didn't, you know that these kinds of requests bring up a lot of questions. They sometimes bring in pain or regret. And don't get me wrong, consent matters. And if you've ever had something happen to you, whether it's big or small, without your consent, you understand how horrible that can be. But when I think about the stories of my friends and the students and the adults that I know have been in similar situations, I find myself wondering, is consent really the best standard? Is consent really the best standard? When it comes to your relationships as a mature person, you have to answer this question because it will drive so many of your decisions. And if you're a Jesus follower, it's an even bigger deal. And I'm not just talking about whether or not to have sex. I'm talking about how we literally treat people, what we ask for, what we talk other people into, and what we try to talk them out of. That's why we're talking about this today. And as we do, I think you'll see that consent is really important, but it's just the beginning of what really matters. It's not the end. When it comes to things like relationship or sex or dating, we can elevate ourselves to a higher standard, and it will really end up clearing up a lot of the confusion and prevent a lot of pain. And that's why we want to talk about this today. And so to help us do this, I want to direct your attention to a passage of scripture that I think will really help us as we go through this conversation today. It's from a letter that's written by a guy named Paul. And in this passage, Paul is talking to a group of Christians who lived in Rome. And Paul was a passionate Jesus follower who was all about treating other people well, so a lot of his letters focused on that. And it's important to remember that there were standards of how to treat each other back in Paul's time, but those standards were really, really low. And Jesus brought a whole new way to the table about how to view yourself and how to view others. And that is what Paul is saying in this particular verse in the book of Romans. Now, at the time, Christianity was brand new. And a lot of people back then were hearing the name of Jesus for the first time. And people didn't really have an assumption of what, it looked like to be a Christian or what it looked like to be a Jesus follower like they do today. And so the best way for people to judge what Christianity was all about was literally to watch people who claimed to follow Jesus. And those were people who would give the world an idea about what this type of faith was really all about. In other words, the reputation of Christianity depended on the way that Jesus followers represented him to the rest of the world. And so for us today, people already have their assumptions about what Christians are like. And the truth is, those assumptions are not always really good. And so you and I have to work even harder to prove those notions wrong. So with that in mind, here's what Paul wrote to the Jesus followers in Rome back then. In Romans chapter 12, he says, "Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourself." Now let's be real here. On the surface, that sounds super basic. But when you actually think about it, how many people actually do that? Not a lot, right? People don't look out for others. They don't protect each other unconditionally. So, in other words, it's all about how you treat other people well. And isn't that still true today? That in some ways, the first century culture wasn't that different from your high school in modern times. For example, you may be in a class or on a team or in a friend group where everybody just looks out for themselves. And Paul is telling us here, there is a better way to live. He consistently tells people that Jesus demonstrated a new way. In Paul's world, suggesting that we show honor for everybody as the standard, that would have been a wild and crazy thing. But for Paul, he knew that it was valuable. Why? Because Paul had had an experience with Jesus that changed everything. And so now he wanted to impact other people's lives by sharing that with them. He knew how Jesus valued and treated others and honored others, including Paul himself. And so because of that, he passionately pushed people to do the same thing, to elevate the way we value people for who they are, what they want, and what they don't want. That was Paul's message, is to elevate the way we value people for who they are, what they want, and what they don't want. This is the example that Jesus set for how we should treat one another. And I love the word that Paul uses here. It wasn't just consent. It was a step above that. He uses the word honor. And honor is another way of saying to show respect. If you respect someone, you do so much more than just the bare minimum. You do the best for somebody in every area, which absolutely includes consent. So kind of like a song that gets stuck in your head that we mentioned earlier. Maybe you've had a situation where you didn't give consent, and you're wondering why it feels as bad as it does. And this is why. Is because you weren't honored or respected. You weren't honored or respected. You were devalued, and that isn't how God intended you or I to be treated. But on the other hand, if you've treated somebody with the bare amount of consideration or the minimum amount of consideration, doing the absolute least communicates the same message to them, that they're not highly valued, respected, or honored. And when it comes to the way that we treat others, especially for those of us that are Jesus followers, we're called to so much more than just the minimum requirements. We're called to elevate our standard above the lowest bar. We're called to honor other people. But Paul goes a step further. He says, honor others above yourself. Honor others above yourselves. And among many things, this means this: doing what's best for them, no matter what you want from them. Doing what's best for them, no matter what you want from them. It means elevating their needs above your own. And even if you want something, even, if they give you the bare minimum of consent, there are still better questions that we need to ask. You see, in so many ways, Jesus changed the way for people to understand this, both then and now. From following Jesus, Paul was teaching other people to see other people and to treat other people differently, to honor them no matter what, because God values them no matter what. And the same is true for you and I today, because you are valuable to God. This also means doing what's best for you and expecting others to show you honor. So because you are valuable to God, this also means doing what's best for you and expecting others to show you honor. So when you're in a situation that you don't want to be in, you can say no and leave if you need to. Or when you're being pressured to do something you don't want to do, you can say no, and that's the end of the story. Or when somebody pushes a boundary that you've set for yourself, you can speak up and be firm. Now, when it comes to the conversation on consent, let's elevate the way that we think about it all, because we're called to express honor to other people. And we should see ourselves deserving of that same honor in a way that others treat us. So it's easy to think that, well, as long as everybody says it's okay, then we're good, right? But we as Jesus followers, we have to raise that bar. When it comes to the topic of consent, you could say it this way, that we have to expect and express honor. Honor is much more higher than the minimum requirement of, well, will I get in trouble or is it legal? It's a higher standard. And if we expect to be honored by others, then we need to express that same honor to them. You see, honor is not just about respecting the consent of other people. It's about respecting the person no matter what. Now, one of the very first things that the Bible tells us about is that we are made and created in the image of God. Now, that means that you and I literally have value in God's eyes. In other words, God sees us as a people who deserve to be honored simply because we exist. God sees us as a people who deserve to be honored simply because we exist. Not because of what we offer or what we can do, but God wants us to see both ourselves and others the same way. In other words, we respect and honor the image of God in others. We should expect others to respect and honor the image of God in us. So as we respect and honor the image of God in others, we should also expect that others are respecting and honoring the image of God in us. So what does it look like? What does that actually look like for you and I to expect honor? Well, it looks like this: for not settling for actions that don't honor. This starts with deciding on how you want to be treated. Determine what honor looks like and what it really means for others to see the image of God in you. Maybe you could start with looking to what God said about honoring each other and then letting a trusted community speak into it as well. And once you know, let somebody you trust in too know that so they can encourage you in getting the honor that you deserve. Don't wait until you're in the moment to try to figure it out. Figure it out now. Because from there, it's important to use your voice to advocate for what you really need. Sometimes I get that can be really hard, but practice speaking up for yourself on small things. And we can learn to be comfortable then when the stakes are much higher, because you deserve honor and should always expect it. So the first thing is to not settle for actions that don't honor. And so what does it mean to really express honor? Well, it means this, is that consent is where honor begins, not where it ends. Consent is where honor begins, not where it ends. Consent is the bare minimum. It's the starting place. Simply because somebody says yes to something doesn't mean that's what's best or what's always honoring. Consent is really important. And we're called, though, to something higher. Even if somebody is saying yes, if you know that it's not what's best for them, then don't do it. If we all consider, is that really what they want? Or is that really what we want? Or is that really what we can get away with? Then it can be really easy to view our relationships and our behaviors or our choices even through a really selfish lens. And if we view it just as, well, what can we get away with? Then that lens is basically saying, well, we're trying to convince people to do something or to make decisions that they wouldn't otherwise make, or they know they shouldn't make. Instead, honoring somebody is literally saying what's best for them and respecting their words and their choices. In other words, when someone says no, they mean it, and they should only have to say it once. Expressing honor means stopping right there. And so with all of that being said, some of you that are watching this today have probably asked, well, I want to be honored. Or maybe you've used your voice, or maybe you've spoken up and your voice wasn't respected. And because of that, you're dealing with feelings of guilt or shame or secrecy or anger. Now, I want you to know, I am so sorry for what happened to you. And I also want you to know that we have a safe place here, that you can talk to somebody, whether it's a pastor, a leader, or a friend, because what we want you to understand is that what was done to you was not honor, and it also wasn't your fault. You see, you can and should still expect and express honor in your life, because you and others deserve it, and nothing can take that away. And so if this is you, part of elevating the way we talk about consent and honor is speaking up and sharing with others what happened to you so that you can begin to work through it. You don't have to do this alone. Because if we can begin to expect and express honor for ourselves and for others, it literally changes everything. Now listen, I get that every dating situation, every late night text thread, every relationship is different. And I get that there's no way that we could possibly talk about what honor means in every situation for every person. And sometimes a topic like consent, it makes us feel really uncomfortable or even confused about what it is that we're supposed to do. And that's why I think we need to talk about the word honor. Is because imagine if we all did this. Imagine if the person that you're dating or the person that you're going to date heard this message and took it seriously. Imagine if your ex took it seriously. Imagine if your friend's significant other chose to express honor to them. You see, so many of our relationships would be better because of it. And I bet our world would be as well. That's why our small groups that we have here in person are so important. It's because our small groups are a place to talk about real life situations with friends and with adults who love you and who care about you. So when you head out today, I want you to think about this particular question. What does it look like to elevate honor and expect and express honor in your daily life, really? What does it look like to elevate honor and expect and express honor in your daily life, really? Well, thank you so much for checking out this video. As we've been diving into this topic of consent, we know that this is a very serious and a very in-depth topic, and we could spend weeks on it. But we wanted to kind of scratch the surface tonight and just tell you this is what it's about. Consent is important. Honoring others is important. Why? Because ultimately when Jesus tells us to love one another, that's what he's really drilling down to. And so as you think about your life, ask yourself, are you respecting and honoring others with your words, your actions, your thoughts? Or are you just scratching the bare minimum, just trying to get by with what, little bit you can do? And I challenge you this week to really apply that, to not just settle for things that are, on the surface, but to really dive in and say, this is what's important for me as a person and how I treat and respect others and how I expect to be honored by others. Thanks so much again for checking out this message. We'd love to see you in person. Again, we meet every Sunday night from 6 to 8 p.m. in the youth room at New Hope. We'd love to have you come and join us as we have a great and amazing time of games and fellowship and worship and small groups and teaching and all kinds of fun. We'd love to see you. Have a great and wonderful rest of your day.